Well, as I mentioned, the interest rates went up today, 0.25 or 25 basis points, I think is the official lingo. It doesn't mean much to ordinary people like you and me, but there you go. The Commonwealth Bank took the opportunity to whack them up a little bit more. The economists, of course, the big-name economists around the country all said, no, we don't think it'll happen. They were wrong again. The last interest rate rise, they were wrong then again. They were wrong about the global, or didn't predict the global financial crisis. Hopefully they had a win in the Melbourne Cup because they haven't been much good at picking anything else. The bottom line is if you want to save money, don't spend it. But what about the banks? Chris Leithner, my occasional finance correspondent, joins me once again from Leithner and Associates. Chris Leithner, thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the banks say they've upped their interest rates, or the Commonwealth in particular, a bit more because of the cost of buying money, basically.
That's right.
It's costing them more money. Now, let me just sort of, first of all, is this true?
Basically, yes. In what the banks would regard as the good old days, or what I'd regard as the bad old days, banks could borrow very, very cheaply overseas. Those loans lasted anywhere between 2 and 6 or 7 years or so. There are various terms. But once those loans have begun to expire, they're replaced with much dearer loans, so that progressively, slice by slice, month by month, the overall cost of the money for which banks have to pay is rising.
All right, so tick. That's right. I'm sure you told me once that what we want in Australia is strong banks with healthy balance sheets and big pots of money, because then they can loan that money out to build things, to build stuff here in Australia rather than importing money. Does this help in any way?
Well, I hope what I said is that first and foremost, well, I guess what I want, whether other people want it or not, are banks that are subject to the same laws as any other business or indeed any other individual. Banks which basically aggregate other people's savings and then find suitable sources to lend those savings. But banks haven't done that in 100 years.
Okay, why haven't they done that in 100 years? I mean, I have no debt. I have a significant pot of money in the bank, but I'm getting pretty ordinary interest rates from it at the moment. But it's the Reserve Bank that sets the interest rates.
Well, that's a shorthand from it, but it's not quite right. What banks have done for roughly 100 years is not to collate true savings. That's to say people living within their means, having a surplus, depositing in it, and then the bank turning around and on lending it. What banks do is lend many times, 10, 12, 13 times the amount of their deposit. So in other words, if you and I and everyone in Australia knock on the door of the big 4 banks and every bank in Australia tomorrow morning, the money's not there. Unlike any other business in the country, they're running, ineffectively, they are all banks, not just in Australia, but in America, England, etc., are bankrupt. Why? Because the vault is empty. They've lent many multiples of what's been deposited. Now, the Reserve Bank...
They're allowed to do that by law, though.
By law, of course.
The federal government says you can do that, no problem.
Indeed, the law not only allows it, the law encourages it. Getting back to your point about the Reserve Bank doesn't quite set interest rates, plural. It fixes, it's a price fixer, which, by the way, the ACCC doesn't seem to know about it, doesn't seem interested. The banks are cartels, which doesn't seem to trouble anyone in this country. What the Reserve Bank and central banks, whether they're in England, America, etc., try to push down rates of interest. They encourage people not to be savers, but to be debtors and spenders. So the reason why people like yourself, and there's a fair few folks who do their best and do live within their means, but it's really difficult. The rewards just aren't there. Why? Because the entire financial system is designed to reward debtors, people who borrow, and by definition, it punishes people who save and provide the wherewithal. If there was a free system or a free market system, dare I say it, the interests of the two would be roughly, they'd correspond to each other, they'd match. You'd have X amount of savings, Y amount of debt, and the two would match, but we simply don't have that.
If you've just tuned in, Chris Leithner is from Leithner and Associates. The interest rate rise today, mainly by the Commonwealth Bank, that upped a little bit more than the Reserve Bank's benchmark. My name's Steve Austin. All right, you mentioned the word cartel. We heard this in the PM program. What does cartel mean? Just define it simply for me.
A cartel is a boys' club. In this case, it's a boys' club organised and enforced by the Commonwealth Government. If you're not a member of it, people who are outside the club need not apply. They cannot apply. Those who are members generate gargantuan benefits for themselves.
Who's in the cartel?
Basically banks. First and foremost, the big 4 banks in this country.
Okay, now, are they acting as a cartel at the moment?
Well, of course, if you're going to be given these mammoth protections and privileges by government, yes, of course you will.
But the federal government does that for a reason, because they want strong, healthy banks. We now have banks in the top 20 banks in the world.
So they tell us. The government doesn't do this because they want healthy banks. Governments do this because the ethos of our age is that spending creates wealth. Governments have it completely, totally backwards. It's not spending which creates wealth. It's the savings, of which you spoke earlier, that creates wealth.
So savings create real wealth.
Correct. Savings accumulates, people invest it, possibly in tangible things, factories and the like, but Bill Gates doesn't create tangible objects, or Microsoft doesn't create tangible objects, but it's wealth nonetheless, in the sense that these are aids which help people to do many things far more productively than they could otherwise.
All right, I'll come to my next question then. The major way in which Australians seem to create wealth is in the family home. And for the last 15, 20 years almost, perhaps ever since the tax summit under the Hawke government, Australians were encouraged to buy a home. Really tax laws were adjusted to get people to buy a home, in other words, to get into debt, because you'll be able to buy a home, sell it a couple of decades later, the price will have gone up, and you'll have made a mozza. And that's apparently the way why we're such a wealthy country, is actually in the family home. In the previous decade, we were encouraged to borrow against the increased value of the home to increase our debt levels. Now that's starting to come to a crunch point. Now that the boil is coming off house prices, or has come off house prices, and interest rates are going only up together. Now, so what does this do for our wealth, inverted commas?
Well, to answer the question, I'll agree with one of the points you made, but disagree with another. You're certainly right to say that for the past generation or more, the entire ethos has been to borrow and to spend. That spending and borrowing, I don't think it does, but that the ethos has been that it creates wealth. That's the polar opposite from our grandparents or our great-grandparents. If they could afford their own house, it was when they're in their 50s and 60s or so, and they paid cash. To them, a mortgage was virtually unknown. Either they couldn't have got one from the bank, or they were afraid of banks and afraid of getting into debt. Remember, debt decades ago had a stigma attached to it, and righteous people simply wouldn't take the risk and therefore wouldn't incur debt. Whereas now, our financial world has turned completely upside down, whereby the higher the debt, the bigger the house, the bigger the mortgage, allegedly, the greater the dollar amount it's going to inflate. Take any number of statistics.
And people have sold their houses at great profit and pocketed the money.
Well, so they think. I get this point a lot, and I say to them, gee, person X will say, 30 years ago I bought this house for $100,000. I sold it the other day for $600,000, and clearly, allegedly, I've made a $500,000 profit. And I say, look, this is a magical house. You never paid a penny of rates on it, did you? No, oh, no, of course I paid tons, and the government or the council taxes me heavily. And I said, oh, it was a magical house. You didn't have to maintain it. You never had to replace the roof or restump it. No, I had to pay a fortune to remove those costs, plus remove the effect of the CPI of inflation, and what you find is that the price of real estate rises, but at a very modest net of all those costs I've just mentioned to you, or those factors. Yes, it does rise. Is it the route to wealth? Americans thought so until very recently. What they're finding, though, is not so much that debt is the road to riches, but for a lot of people it's now become a prison from which they simply can't escape. Dare I say it's a prison from which the U.S. government is beginning to find itself trapped.
Today we have interest rates probably will go up a little bit more by the looks of things, and people are in mortgages that they will have to pay off in what are relatively good times for Australia. So they should be able to cope with it. Is that that's a successful wealth strategy, isn't it? Surely.
If it is the case that spending leads to wealth, why isn't Haiti among the world's wealthiest countries? Haitians, Somalis, people in Iraq, Afghanistan, and wretchedly poor countries can spend like just anyone else. The trouble is that they are wretchedly poor countries. So clearly there's
something... Their currency has no value, we're told. That's why they're not wealthy.
That's interesting.
Australia has a currency that's on parity now with the United States.
Indeed, as I left my office, it's now slightly above parity by 1/10 of 1 cent. The trouble, though, go back 100 years and compare the purchasing power of the US dollar, the pound, and the Australian dollar. That which cost you $1 Australian in a post-decimal sense, or converting them into the current sense, is now going to cost you something like $115. That's a compound rate of inflation in the 1,000 or 2,000%, or in very rough terms. That doesn't strike me. In other words, central banks have destroyed progressively over the past century the purchasing power of currencies. the point that we've been talking about, creating ever more debt, ever more spending and so on. Yes, capital has been formed, but it's despite the actions of government, not because of the actions of government. It's despite this mentality of more debt and more and more spending creates wealth that these sorts of things have occurred. So I'm very, very leery, I suppose, on a good day, and on a bad day I'll hotly dispute the notion that more spending and more debt leads to wealth. And there's now more and more people in America and England who will ruefully agree with that point.
So will today's interest rate rise encourage savings? Is there this encouragement to save money?
My guess, and it's only a guess, no. It's very difficult to change an ethos. Only some sort of a shocking event, perhaps the events in the United States over the past, say, 3-4 years or so, has begun to cause people to reflect and to say, in effect, we're like the hamsters who are running on the treadmill here. We have to run really hard simply to stand still. Is that a sensible way? There's a ferment of ideas there which I don't quite see in Australia. So it seems to me the short answer to your question is people say, oh, well, my mortgage payments now, if I have a variable rate, will rise a bit, but that hasn't fundamentally changed the strategy that I should borrow as much as I possibly can and then hope and pray that the price in nominal terms of real estate rises over the years, and therefore I can make my paper profit.
What happens if house prices continue to go soft like they are? People start to lose money.
Then we're in real trouble.
Okay.
That if the entire strategy, as you pointed out, and I agreed with that part of your question, is predicated upon a rise of property prices, and if that doesn't transpire, then something's gone severely awry with the strategy. People find themselves, as many Americans have, or people in England have, my mortgage is this big and the market price of my house is not as big as my mortgage. What on earth do I do? My strategy's in the gurgler now.
Last Sunday just passed, was World Savings Day. It was established in 1924 by the International Savings Bank Congress. I'd never heard of this mob, but it seems to have got lost in the years of history.
Indeed, and I confess I hadn't heard of it until you brought it to my attention. For me, 31st of October has always been Martin Luther Day and Reformation Day. I hadn't realised that there is a World Savings Day. But look, ultimately, say that we've talked about the economic, the fundamental importance in economic and financial terms of savings, but there's also a moral dimension here. People who save, people who can set aside for a rainy day, or people who force themselves to see into the future, who force themselves to say, time has a value. I have choices here. By constraining my expenditure today, I can create options for myself in the future. But that takes a lot of discipline. It means walking past a shop window and either closing your eyes
and not spending money.
And not spending money. It means, in terms of adverts on the TV, and they're obviously not the ABC and so on, but on commercial television, sure. It means ignoring the ads. It basically means closing your eyes and ears, blocking your ears to the entire modern ethos, which is to take your paycheck and to spend not just all of your paycheck, but another 5 and 10% on top of that to go into net debt.
So in other words, economists can't predict the future. They've pretty much always been wrong most of the time. They're not prophets. Save money and you'll have at least a cushion for the future.
Our grandparents and our great-grandparents, it seems to me, were far more insightful economists than the current crop are, that the utterances of Ivy League economists with their Nobel Prizes might be befitting of an Ivy League institution, but it's not befitting of the common sense of a taxi driver or a hairdresser or a farmer. In other words, it seems to me people of modest means and everyday sort of walks of life have far more sense than folks in Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Princeton.
Thanks for coming in, Chris Leithner.
Great pleasure.